Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think let me us wait one more minute, allow other attendants to join. We will start soon. Okay, let's start. Good morning, everyone. I'm Zhihong, a fourth-year PhD student in school nursing, and also our NSF AR/VR PhD fellow. Thank you for joining us this morning for the Voice of SR with Benjamin Suarez Jimenez. This series is made possible by Cassie McMurray and the National Science Foundation as a part of the interdisciplinary graduate training in science, technology, and application of the augmented and virtual reality at University of Rochester. I would like to thank Dr. Benjamin Suarez Jimenez for joining us today. Dr. Suarez Jimenez is assistant professor of neuroscience at the University of Rochester. His research program in the ZVR lab aimed to use the virtual reality multimodal magnetic resonance imaging and the machine learning to elucidate the psychological and neuroscience nature of post-trauma stress disorder and anxiety disorder, particularly to delineate the contextual aspects of the threat, rewarding learning, discrimination, and monitoring. So that Jimenez is especially interested in the cases where an area with a larger environment becomes associated with threats, such as our neighbor, where our thousands take place, or a location on a battlefield where explosion occurred. Patients with post-trauma stress disorder and anxiety disorder often show our overgeneralizing or exaggerated response to threats in our large context, even if the environment is safe. With this research, he planned to identify new brain measures to develop sensitive personalities and process diagnostic and treatment tool for psychology. So thus, Jimenez came to the university in January 2021. He recently received our 3.5 million grant from National Institute of Mental Health to build upon works in the ZVR lab. Please feel free to post your question in the chat, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. Lastly, this session is being recorded and will be available for you later on the Studio X website. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Suarez Jimenez.
Thank you, Sihong. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I just want to start by saying you can post your questions as Sihong said in the chat, or feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions. I will not be seeing much of the chat or the hand raises. So yeah, just feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me. So today I'm going to be talking about the brain mechanisms of discrimination learning. As Sihong said, that's one of the main aspects of my lab. I will be toning down a little bit the brain talk as I am trying to make this talk a little bit more broad for the audience. But again, if you want to know more specific details about it, please feel free to ask. And for today, I'm going to be focusing on the spatial navigation aspects and attention. In line with the seminar series, I'm going to be talking mostly about the technologies that we're integrating in the lab, particularly the the VR environments that we create, and how we're collecting data in different modalities. Um, so just to go over this again a little bit, my research interest is overall is how to better connect the brain and psychopathology. So there is a huge gap where in psychopathology and psychiatry and psychology, there is no physiological signatures of disorders. Most of the time when we diagnose someone with a psychiatric or mental health disorder, it's based on symptoms that the patient is telling us or disclosing. But there's no behavior, I mean, there's no physiological or neurological test for any of these disorders. So if you can imagine, if you go to your doctor and you tell him, I'm sick, I have nausea, and then the doctor goes and say, oh, you probably have a virus, here's some prescription for it. Or like you injure your leg and they just say, oh, let's put you in a cast because it could be that you broke it, instead of that you pulled a muscle or something. So in medicine, there's a lot of ways to see whether you have an injury or a disease, but we don't have that in psychiatry. And so this is essential so that we can improve the diagnosis and of these disorders, and also to improve the treatment selection. As of now, for psychology and psychiatry, we often just try a medication or a psychotherapy, and then if that doesn't work, we go for another one and another one, and this can be quite taxing for our patients. So I'm hoping that with my research, we can find better ways to diagnose and select treatment options based on the way that the brain reacts, and the way that the brain is connected with each other. So today I'm going to be talking about the work that I've been doing to use cognitive mapping and virtual reality to assess brain activity of these areas. I'm going to be talking a bit about how we're integrating eye tracking methodologies to these tasks, and then some future directions that my lab is currently undergoing. So cognitive mapping, the cognitive map is basically the way that the brain builds representations of your spatial environment to support memory and guide future actions. I'm pretty sure that you could all imagine how you can walk from one room to another, or how you get from home to work. And you could probably even see it in your mind's eye, how you would navigate your environment to get to that place. When we move to new locations or we go to new environments, we are always building these maps of where we are and where we want to go. So now imagine that you move here. This is a new neighborhood, and you decide to go on morning walks or evening walks around the neighborhood. And then in one of these walks, you get bitten by a dog, or you get mugged, or something bad happens along the way. You might start associating that area where that happened with a potential danger, or you might start feeling anxious around that area. But over time, in healthy participants or healthy people, they eventually go back to their normal routine. You learn that the person that mugged you got apprehended, or that the dog was just loose and they capture it. So, it never happened again. And you hear from your neighbors that this has never happened. And eventually you go back to your normal routine and you feel comfortable around that area again. However, in patients with psychopathologies, it's often the case that this becomes worse and worse, and to the point that they don't leave their house, because they start seeing the world as a dangerous environment. So I am very interested in how do we build those cognitive maps to distinguish threat, safety, and reward. So, for example, when that happens, you don't put a red tape around that area like a physical red tape or yellow tape saying do not cross, danger of dog, or danger of potential mugging. You kind of put that in your own head. And so you kind of compartmentalize those areas, and you may say, oh, I wouldn't go down that street. There's a loose dog there. I got bit once. And it's kind of like an imaginary line that you build upon the maps that you're building of your environment. So I am very interested in how these systems break down in psychopathology such as PTSD, anxiety, depression, where instead of being compartmentalized to the specific area where it happens, it just expands and expands, and it overgeneralizes to other areas and other situations. So to test this, we built a virtual environment, and I'm gonna play a video. So in this task, we ask participants to collect flowers, and as they collect the flowers, they are asked to rate how likely they are to receive a sting. So we tell the participants that as they collect flowers, there might be bees inside of them, which will sting them. So the sting is represented by an electrical stimulation that they get to their hand. So as the participants collect flowers, they are learning about this new environment. So this is a, let me see, laser pointer. Okay, so this is a circular environment. And what the participant doesn't know is that we've divided it in half. So one half of the environment is always safe, meaning that they will never receive a shock from that area or a bee sting. And then on the other side is dangerous. So 50% of the flowers in the dangerous side will be associated with an electrical stimulation. So participants have to use these mountains and the sky and the sun. And then there's these two beehives on each side of the environment. They have to use those landmarks to kind of orient themselves of where they are and where they're going. And so we are measuring the way that they approach the flowers. As they're approaching flower, that's considered kind of a distal threat. And it's associated with anxiety, particularly when you're feeling the anxious feeling of approaching that flower that potentially can give you a shock. And then once they collect the flower, they have to rate the flower, and then they're held stationary in the place where they collect the flowers. And because they've engaged with the flower, now that's becoming an immediate threat. So that signature we collect is a signature of fear or panic. All right, so just to go over a little bit, the trials, as I said, are composed with a flower appears, the participant approach the flowers, they collect the flower and they rate it. Then they're hold stationary for 2 to 8 seconds, with that period co-terminating with a shock if they are in the dangerous area. And then a new flower appears and they have to find it. So they have 80 flowers that they have to collect, 40 in the safe zone and 40 in the danger zone, with 20 of them being associated with a shock. And as they're doing this, we are collecting their skin conductance. So that's basically how they're sweating. And that's a sign of anxiety or arousal. We are asking them to report their expectancy of a shock. So how likely they think that flower will be associated with a shock. And they're doing this inside of an fMRI scanner, or an MRI. So we are collecting brain activity as they're doing this. And so for us to analyze the data, we look at the approach. So as they're approaching the flower, and the stationary period separately. Again, as I said, the approach is a signature of anxiety, and the stationary period is a signature of fear. And so within those analyses, we look at the differences between when they're engaging with flowers in the safety side versus when they're engaging with flowers in the danger side. And then we also investigate the early phases or part of the learning versus the late phases. So basically when they're very naive to the task versus when they have already learned to discriminate between the flowers. And so this study was published a couple of years ago in PNAS, but this is what we found on healthy controls. So on healthy subjects, we found that, so let me guide you through the illustration. This is basically an overview panel of the task of participants having to go find flowers. And again, this is pictures of the flowers and the beehives and the environment. So on the bottom, we have the skin conductance levels. So this is the period when they are approaching the flowers. We have the skin conductance response. This is when once they've collected the flower and they're in that panic or state, or when they're waiting for that shock. And then we have their self-report of expectancy ratings. And what we find here in this, so all three are divided in 4 blocks of 10 trials each. So in number 1, 2, 3, and 4, these are the first 10 flowers, 20 flowers, 30 flowers, 40 flowers. And in the open circles, we have the danger, and on the closed squares, we have the safety trials. And what we find is that they're really good at this. So within the first 10 trials, they've already learned to discriminate between the safety and the dangerous area. And so, yeah, what is interesting is that their physiological response takes a little bit longer to kind of reflect their learning. So even within the first 10 trials of both, we see that they still are not showing that discrimination. So they're feeling still anxious and or fearful in both as they're approaching the flower and once they've collected the flower. But by the second 20, they've already kind of their physiological arousal is already showing that discrimination between safety and danger. So this is very interesting because not only do we see that they're able to learn and that they do it really quickly, but that there's a difference between the cognitive process of saying, yes, this is safe, this is dangerous. There's a with the physiological responses that even though you can say, yes, I know I'm safe, the body is still reflecting some sort of anxiety or arousal. Now, when we look at the brain, we see several brain areas. And again, I'm not going to go in too much details of these areas. But overall, what we find is that when participants are approaching a flower or engaging with those flowers in the danger zone, we see a lot of areas that are associated with the salience network. So basically the areas of the brain that are associated with threat monitoring and pain monitoring and responses. The interesting thing is that we also found a network of areas that are associated with the learning period. So regardless if they are approaching or interacting with a flower in the danger or in the safety zones, these are areas of the brain that engage more over time. And these are areas that are associated with learning and memory, spatial navigation, like the hippocampus here, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with self-referential learning and emotional regulation. So while we did see this common or expected brain network of the salience network, we started identifying what we're calling this discrimination learning network. So that is becoming online as participants are learning to discriminate. One interesting thing that I liked in this data is that so the hippocampus, as I said, which is a memory associated brain area, and it's associated with spatial navigation. we see that it becomes active or more active over time. The interesting thing is that depending if you're approaching a flower or if you're engaging with the flower in the stationary period, it depends where in the hippocampus is being active. So the closer you are to the flower, the more posterior or back of the hippocampus is being active. And I'm not gonna go too much into that, but the point is that this is a lot of rodent work has looked at place cells and so basically the way that the hippocampus, the cells in the hippocampus react to locations, and this is very in line with that, where more broad memories are encoded in the front part of the hippocampus and more specific memories are encoded on the back of the hippocampus. So it was very exciting to see that finding. All right. So another thing that we do while the participants are doing this task is that we ask them to collect 4 objects that are never associated with a shock. So this is, in this case, a book, a wooden crate, a can, it's like a jerry can for gasoline, and a clock. And these objects are interleaved with every 4 flowers, and there are 2 in the safe zone and 2 in the danger zone. And so we look at the mean distance error. So basically we ask the participant to collect the object, and then after 4 flowers, after collecting all 4 types of objects, they are randomly asked to put back one of those objects. And we measure over time how they do in placing those objects back. So this is what, again, in the task, they're asked to collect one of these objects, in this case, the book, and they collect it, and then later in the game, they're asked to return the book. So now they have to go back to where they found that object, and they have to place it where they think it goes. Once they place it, the object is returned to their original position, and they have to collect it again. And they're asked to do, for each object, they're asked to return it 4 times. So over time, hopefully they get better at it. And indeed, that's what we find. What we find is that regardless if they are in the danger or in the safe zone, over time, the participants get better at placing those objects. The interesting thing is that regardless of the object, this discrimination learning network that I discussed before is very specific to the flowers. So while participants are really good at remembering the location of these objects and discriminating between the flowers in the safe zone and in the danger zone, this discrimination learning network that we discussed is very specific to the flower task. So it's not about learning or spatial navigation. It is about discriminating between safety and dangerous flowers within an environment. However, we do see, as you see here, that at the beginning of the task, this discrimination learning network behave very similarly. But over time, we see that with the flower task, it becomes very specific to the flower task, while it stops or decreases that activity for the object task. So again, it's showing that at the beginning of the task, when you're learning and even discriminating between the flowers and the neutral objects, this discrimination learning network is becoming online. But then as you learn, oh, these objects are completely benign, nothing will happen to me. What I need to learn is the differences between the flowers within the safe and the danger zone. It becomes very specific to the flower task. All right. So now I'm going to pivot a little bit in talking about eye tracking methodologies. And well, I'll say more about that later. Another aspect of my lab is looking at selection history. So the selection history is basically how prior experiences that you have kind of like informs subsequent experiences. So if you get bitten by a dog, you are more likely to notice dogs in the environment, or you're more likely to pay attention to dogs. So, or if you really like coffee over ice cream, then you're more likely to notice coffee in pictures. And yeah, I don't like chocolate, so if people show me chocolates, I probably don't pay much attention to it. But if somebody shows me coffee or an ice cream, I would be very attentive to that. So yeah, so it's basically how you learn by association. So like certain things or items gain value based on your experiences, and that guides your future attention to that. And yeah, so we have done some tasks, and so this we did in patients with PTSD, and then we had some controls of people who were exposed to trauma who did not develop PTSD, and then people who has never been exposed to trauma. And so what we did is that we had 3 blocks of 30 different matrices of faces. So this is one matrix of a face. So we show them this type of matrices 30 times with different faces. And so we had 3 blocks of that. So one block was with angry faces. So as you see here, some with the second block was fearful faces, as you see here. And then the third block was sad faces, as you see here. And so the 3 blocks were either had an emotional phase or a neutral phase. And the blocks were shown in different orders depending on the participant, and the faces were also randomly assigned to the spaces within the matrix. So everything was counterbalanced. What we have seen in patients with, and we've shown this in patients with depression, PTSD, OCD, is that actually the way that they spend time looking at those faces, so the average total dwell time, so again, like how they're looking at those faces, is that healthy people tend to look more at the neutral pictures than any of the emotional pictures. On the contrary, in this case, people with PTSD, they look more at the negative pictures or negative emotion pictures than the neutral pictures. And we find that overall, when they look at a face, they spend PTSD and trauma exposed people spend more or less the same time looking at the face. So if they look at a threat face, they spend about the same time that if they're looking at a neutral face. The interesting thing is that healthy people spend much more time looking at, when they look at a neutral face, they stay there looking at that face much more than when they're looking at a negative emotion face. So when they look at a negative emotion face, they tend to shift their gaze much more faster. So in a way, I like to joke, or the way that I see this data is the one that have the bias is usually the people who are healthy. So they have a bias against or away from negative emotions. So in a way, they tend to avoid negative emotions, while patients with PTSD seem to be a little bit more balanced between those two. And what we actually found with that data is that this is associated with differences in reward-related areas. So the connectivity between the nucleus accumbens and the orbitofrontal cortex is, so the connectivity between those 2 areas is decreased in patients with PTSD, and it's increased in patients or in healthy controls. So the more that they spend, the people who spend the more time looking at negative valence faces, they're the people who have the least connectivity between these reward related and emotional regulation areas. So, which again, I found very interesting, because it, like it shows that healthy controls who spend more time looking at these neutral pictures, they are getting some sort of reward from this, while patients are not getting this type of reward. And you know, it's very, so why I started looking at attention is because this is a very small, this is a study that we did again in patients with PTSD using a different task. It's a dot probe task. Basically, they see some pictures of human faces, 2 human faces, and then they disappear, and there's a dot behind one of them, and they have to press a button on the direction of where that dot appears. So if you're looking, you're more likely to respond faster to the dot when it appears behind the face that you are looking at. So the point here is to show that, you know, we have patients that are more avoidant, and then so they avoid more things, and then we have other patients that are more hypervigilant, so they pay more attention to that. And what we find in this study is that when we analyze the data aggregated across all patients, we see no differences. But if we take into consideration their symptoms, so either avoidance or hypervigilant, and we treat them according to that bias in the opposite direction, then we see better response to treatment, as you see here, when we take into consideration their bias towards or the bias away from the threat, and we treat them in the opposite direction, we find that they all go kind of down to 0 in their bias. So it's very important, or we found that that attention is quite important in the way that we think about psychopathologies and the way that we treat them. So, and as I showed before, we also show that it has implications in the brain and its connectivity. So why am I saying this? Well,
Doctor,
I'll talk about.
Yeah, Dr. Suarez Jimenez, there is a question posted in the chat. Would you mind pause here, answer the question?
Yeah. Let me see if I can see the questions. I don't like chocolate. I'm sorry. If you're questioning, okay. You say that those individuals with PTSD tend to have more of a balance in the amount of time that they focus on someone with a positive face versus a negative face, especially compared to a healthy, controlled individual. What is the reasoning behind this? Is it harder for them to recognize the negative face as negative? Does their trauma create a tolerance for negativity? That's a very good question. No, they are able to recognize the differences between the faces. It's more that I like to compare it with, it's like a glass window, it's shattered, or their expectation of the world is kind of shattered when they have a trauma in this case, which makes them less naive. I don't know. I tend to think about healthy individuals as a little bit naive on the world, that because nothing bad has happened to them, and I'm not a criticism. When I would see patients in New York City and we had healthy controls, I would always congratulate them for living in such a city and not being exposed to any trauma, because it's very hard not to, particularly in the world that we're living in. So, you know, when you're exposed to a trauma, and going back to selection history, it changes the way that you see the world. So it is not that patients with PTSD that it creates a tolerance for negativity. I think is that people who have never been exposed to negative events in their life are less tolerant of them. So in a way, I guess, I don't think it's that that when you are exposed to a trauma, you become more tolerant. I think you become more aware. And because you're more aware, you're more likely to pay attention to that, based on your previous experiences. When you have never had experiences with trauma, for example, then you're more likely not to want to be engaged with it. You might want to avoid it. Um, yeah, does that answer your question, Cody? Okay, great. And great question, by the way. Okay, so future directions. Okay, so some of the things that we are doing, as I said, we have the flower task, which is focusing on threat learning. We want to see whether if the reward circuitry, because as I also showed in the eye tracking data, we find that the reward circuitry is very important in the way that we look at things. So we want to see whether the reward processes is also involved in the way that we navigate the world. Again, going back to, instead of using an example of getting bit by a dog or getting mugged, I'm pretty sure that you all have your favorite places, places where you have really happy memories, a wedding, your favorite coffee shop or ice cream shop or chocolate shop, I don't know. So you may, I don't know, the place where you got your first kiss, or, like there's many places that we associate with happy memories. And again, we don't put any physical tape around it, but I'm pretty sure that when we walk around those areas and we're flooded with those memories, we feel some sort of happiness, and we tend to say, oh yeah, that's my favorite park, or oh yeah, that's my favorite coffee shop, or I really love that city, or that town, or whatever. So again, we our brain's map, we put this green tape around those areas of places that we really like. So I want to see whether these processes are also affected in reward in psychopathology, um, and also how do they look in healthy participants. So to do this, we built a kind of like a mirror task to the flower task. So it's, again, a circular environment, but in this case, we tell the participants that they have to collect these moon rocks, which are full of fuel, and as they're collecting them, again, they have to rate how likely they are to get fuel from those rocks. And so they get some points when they get a rock with fuel, and they have a rewarding sound as well, kind of like Candy Crush or something like that. So again, it's a circular environment, and they have this like planets and star clusters. There's a spaceship around that they're using to navigate themselves. So this is what we are currently doing in my lab, is using this task to assess how its reward process in the brain, and how is that affected in patients with PTSD. Another task that we built, which we still have not used, is again a third task related to this spatial discrimination learning. But in this case, we are putting the two emotions to compete. So in this task, they are in a desert, and they have to collect these vases. Now in the vase, there could be a treasure inside, or there could be a scorpion. And if there's a scorpion, you'll receive a sting or an electrical stimulation. And if there's a treasure, you get points, and again, a rewarding sound. So again, in this one, in this one, half of the environment is related to rewards. So 50% of the time they get a reward, and in the other half, they get 50% of the time they get a shock. So again, with the first two, we're trying to look at the discrimination learning process that is very specific to reward and threat separately. Here, we want to see how those emotions compete, because as we explore the world, you know, there's good things and bad things within the same world. There's not like you appear in a good world for a while and then appear in a bad world for a while. So because there's no divisions, or, you know, we live in a continuous type of environment, we want to see what happens when you're in environments where both threat and reward compete. So like, for example, if you had to cross or go through an alleyway to go through to your favorite coffee shop, or cross a very busy street to go to your favorite place, or, you know, when people live in neighborhoods that are both dangerous and it has their favorite memories of, you know, like their parents or brothers and sisters or friends. So I want to see how those memories compete with each other within the same environment. And what is the brain signatures of this? So how does the brain react to these things? So, and going back or integrating it back to eye tracking, we are using eye tracking. So instead of creating matrices of faces, we are creating matrices of the task, where it has some of the flowers here, for example, and some of the background. And we are doing this task where we show 30 matrices of this task before and after they do the task in the MRI. And the purpose is, again, to see how does your attention changes from before the task, when you should know nothing about the task, to after the task, when you may have learned to discriminate between the safe and dangerous areas, or the rewarding and non-rewarding areas of the environment. So in this case, in the flower case, the flowers themselves don't say anything. They don't hold any meaningful information, because both flowers could have a shock or a bee or no bee. So the important things is the background, where you are in your environment. So we want to see, would participants spend more time looking at the background pictures or at the flower pictures? Would the patients with PTSD spend more time looking at the threatening flowers, or the areas of the environment, let's say it's by the Green Mountains, that are associated with the danger? And the same, how does that behave in reward processes? Another line of research that we are in the process now of building is translating some animal tasks. So we have the platform mediated avoidance task that was developed by a collaborator of mine in Puerto Rico. Basically, there's like some reward and water in this section, but it's in a threat zone. So this is a grid panel where the mice could get a shock. And then there's this green safe zone where the mice never gets a shock, but it's away from the reward. So what happens is that over time, the mice is here drinking or getting some reward, and there's a tone that indicates that in 30 seconds, a shock is coming. So what they are looking at is, how long does it take for the mice to stop drinking or getting reward to go into the safe zone? And they see that there's some mice that are more avoidant, so that they will go faster to the safe zone. And there's some that are more risky, so that they'll spend more time in the threat zone. So again, it's this competition between reward and threat that is very important for psychopathology such as addiction, where people with addictive disorders, they tend to spend more time engaging in risky behavior, regardless of potential harm to them. On the other side, there's also people with depression who are less likely to spend time doing getting the reward, because they're not interested in the reward. And then in anxiety disorders, where they are more anxious about the threat, they tend to avoid more. So already with a task like this, we can look at kind of the same type of behavior, but from 3 different perspectives. The same with this crossing mediated conflict task. So I should say that this platform-mediated avoidance task, it focused more on the avoidance part. The crossing mediation conflict task focus more on the approach side. So in this case, we have two safe zones, and the mice can get reward from either side. It's indicated by a light where the reward is coming from. But they do have to cross this grid where if there's a tone, it indicates that it's electrified. So again, the question is, would the rodent cross even though even though the grid may be electrified to get the reward? So this is considered like a conflict right now, you know, like, do I put myself at risk to get the reward? And again, this is very significant for psychopathologies of stress and anxiety and depression and addiction, gambling. So we can see how so we're trying to translate this into virtual reality environments where participants will play a game similar to this so that we can observe their behavior for approach and avoidance. And then the last thing that I will say that we're hoping to do in my lab is to take all of these things to really immersive virtual reality. So right now we have created all these tasks which the participants are playing, but they're not immersive. So hopefully we can start using these technologies to create more immersive tasks to study these behaviors. And with that, I just want to acknowledge all my mentors and collaborators and my funding. And yeah, I can take any questions now if there's any. I don't know if there's any hand up or anything. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and just ask. No pressure. There doesn't have to be one.
Can you just expand what you started to talk about at the end about the virtual reality and how you would apply VR to this, to your research?
Yeah. So a lot of the things that we are doing is kind of like how people are learning about their environment. So right now, a lot of the time they're laying on a bed, and it's quite engaging. I mean, because it's still a game. They're moving their avatar freely. There's no trials. Everything is very continuous. But you know, with VR, immersive VR technology that people are starting to get more, it can become more engaging in the way that they're interacting with the objects in their environment. The reality becomes higher. So I think we could create even more bigger environments to study bigger environments. How do I say that? We can create bigger environments to see how the participant is interacting and engaging and exploring it. One of the biggest limitations is that we cannot put the eye tracking, or well, not the eye tracking, the Oculus, for example, which is the ones that we have in the lab. We cannot take them inside of the MRI. So it might help answer questions about the it might help answer questions more about the behavioral side of things, but not so much about the brain imaging of things at this moment. I mean, there's companies that are building these for the MRI, but I mean, they're quite expensive, and the technology is still not there, or at least the resolution and all that. So yeah.
I had a few questions. So one is, so in my group, we work with EEG signals. So I'm wondering if EEG would be of interest for some of the VR tasks, or whether that provides information that might be useful as well. I know there's spatial resolution issues and all of that, but
yeah, no, for sure. Particularly because with EEG, we could go into well, it has a better temporal resolution, right? So we can observe these processes in a better temporal space. EEG is something that I've kind of wanted to do for a while. I have a collaborator in London that is doing that. They did the flower task in healthy controls using EEG, and they found really interesting results. So yeah, but I'm not sure if they're going to continue down that route for other psychopathologies. So, or for psychopathologies in general. So that's something that I would like to explore. Um, I don't know, as part of my PhD, I was supposed to learn about EEG, but I didn't. So I never really delved into it because I focus on the MRI aspect of things. But yeah, it's something that I've even talked to some of my students about, that they do, some of them do have some um, um, knowledge in EEG. So we've talked about it. I don't know if we can do it ourselves, but for sure collaborating on that would be great.
I have a follow-up question. All the data, either MRI or fear, anxiety, and the skin context, are these tests conducted during the experiment or after the experiment?
So all of the MRI data, the physiological data, and the expectancy ratings are being collected online as they are doing the task.
After?
During.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of the data is being collected during the task.
So I wonder if the timing of their response, the timing for their answer, the question will influence your final results. Like if they conduct the response question, or you test their data immediately or in the middle or after the impairment, will have some different, have some difference.
Yeah, and that's why we do divide the trials into blocks of 10, and why we look at differences between the beginning of the experiment versus the end of the experiment is because of that, because as they are learning and the way that they're reacting to the environment, and that the way that they're interpreting the environment changes. So it's very important to look at different time points within the task to see how those responses and of the body physiologically, or even in the brain, or even in the way that they're responding to the questions, are changing over time.
Just a quick question on the first study you showed on flower collection. Maybe I missed this. Showed results for healthy individuals, but did you also have results for PTSD patients in terms of things like threat learning or threat expectation? And how are they different?
Yeah, so yes and no. So we did this task in patients with anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, and some of them had generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. And we found that patients with anxiety disorders were really good at learning as well to discriminate between safety and danger, which we were very surprised about. But their brain was more, it would engage less the discrimination learning network, and it would engage more the salience network. And we saw that even though that they were able to discriminate between safety and danger, their bodies or their physiology was not reflective of this. So even though they could say, I know I'm safe, they still felt anxious and unsafe. Now, in patients with PTSD, we have some pilot data that I collected with an earlier grant I had. But this is what we're exploring now in my lab with a recent R01 that I got. But the preliminary data was showing that patients with PTSD were not even able to learn to discriminate between safety and danger, or they had more trouble discriminating. And in so their physiology as well would reflect that. So yeah, so we already started seeing differences between different type of psychopathologies.
Maybe a quick related question. So I understand the studies you showed here are more focused on understanding the behavior, but also there's the other question of, let's say, managing or rehabilitation of PTSD for things using things like VR. Is that of interest to you as well, to do emotion regulation and other things? Is that of interest too?
It is. And I mean, in my previous research, I've done it in different ways, not just in VR. We've looked at the way that the brain changes after treatment. I've done some studies looking at if we can predict treatment outcome using brain activity before treatment. The same, all the studies with eye tracking that I've done, some of them have been about treatment of PTSD. Now with VR, so I'll say two things. Yes, I'm interested in the applications of VR for treatment selection and for treatment itself. One of the biggest things and why I have been focusing more on brain activity and behavior is because, as I said at the in addition to what I said at the beginning, that we don't have physiological measures of the disorders, we don't really understand the psychopathology itself yet. So I think that we first need to characterize the disorder physiologically and behaviorally so that we can find better ways to treat it and to diagnose it. So yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about the intensity, duration, or the type of the stress, because I'm doing research on resilience. So the type of stressor or the intensity or duration of stressor or the stress can influence individuals' response, either psychological or other neural changes. So I'm kind of curious, what's the difference between the type, intensity, duration of stress can influence the response?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of research on that. I can't say that my research touches on that because, I mean, it is a stressful situation. You are getting shocks, but the shocks are not that intense. I mean, it feels like a static shock, like when you open a car door or like a door and it gives you a static shock. It's more like that jump, like, oh, and then you're more resistant to touching the door again, or you feel more hesitation to open the door. But it's not really high stressing, or at least I don't see it as a huge stressor. I mean, particularly compared to that these people already have past traumas that are more intensive than what we're giving them in the lab. So we see the shocks, and what we calibrate the shocks to is to a level that is uncomfortable and undesirable, but not painful. So we're not trying to cause the participant pain. We're trying to cause discomfort. So we're not trying to create a stressful situation. We're trying to create an association. However, having said that, we have seen that even in healthy control, there are some people that do not learn to discriminate between safety and danger. And we've seen that we are writing a paper about this now. And what we see is that one of the biggest differences between the people that learn and don't learn is their state anxiety before the task, not their trait anxiety. So trait anxiety is how you usually are, state is how you feel at that moment. And the higher your state anxiety before the task, the less likely you are to learn how to discriminate between safety and danger. So I can't really answer your question directly because it's not what we are measuring, but we see some effects of stress and in our task itself indirectly.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to know that.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. I was just curious, you mentioned in one of your findings that when you were measuring attention, you found a difference between, you found a difference in the reward pathways for people with PTSD versus without. I was just curious, is that, because I know, for example, for some neurodivergent people, like with ADHD, you can also see the difference in those brain structures was like in reward pathways. Are there in any way similar patterns or similarities in between the way this difference is present sometimes on the spectrum versus in people with PTSD?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer, to be honest. I don't know. The reward circuitry is something that it's really new to my line of research. I usually, throughout my career, I've mostly focused on threat-related processes. And it is now, or I mean, it's been being discussed for a while that we also have to look at reward processes. What I would think is, I mean, in PTSD is the only disorder that you need a traumatic event to happen in order to be diagnosed. And we do see that post-trauma, so we see, yeah, regardless if you, so post-trauma, regardless if you develop PTSD or not, there's some brain changes that happen. So I am guessing, or what I'm expecting to find in our data is that people with trauma, regardless of psychopathology, they will have altered brain activity from controls in both the threat and the reward circuitry. I may see it more in the threat processing. Maybe the reward circuitry is the one that is making some resilient versus some not. So those who can maintain their reward circuitry intact, then that may help them bounce back from the trauma, versus those that may have reward related deficits may be the ones that develop the psychopathologies. That is my hypothesis. I don't know yet. But how it expands to the spectrum, or I don't know.
That's fair. Thank you so much.
But it's a cool question to ask, and I mean, it would be super cool to see.
Are there any more questions? If no, we can wrap this. Okay. We can wrap this conversation.
Thank you everyone for coming and for listening.
Thank you so much, man. This was great.
Thanks, Ben.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Susan Jimenez, join us. We are very grateful to learn about your work. Also, thank you also everyone who attended today. I would like to continue. If you would like to continue following Dr. Suarez Jimenez's work, please follow him and his VR web. The link is posted in the chat. Please also check the rest of the Voice of XR speaker series. Our next speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Raffle who is the director of the innovation at Space Force, and will discuss innovation and emerging technology they use. The link is also posted in the chat. Thank you all, and wish you have a great day.